You're listening to CRV's Better Heard podcast, brought to you in partnership with the New Zealand dairy exporter. Join us as we talk to CRV experts, industry leaders and farmers about hot topics and issues affecting herd improvement in New Zealand's dairy industry today.
DairyNZ and AgResearch have jointly released findings from a study that shows New Zealand dairy farmers have the world's lowest on-farm carbon footprint. In fact, their emissions are half of other international milk producers. Commissioned by DairyNZ, the study was independently produced by AgResearch and peer-reviewed by an international specialist in Ireland. Today, I'm joined by André Mazzetto from AgResearch, who is one of the scientists behind the work. André is a biologist and currently works as a life cycle assessment scientist at AgResearch's Lincoln campus in Christchurch. He has a master's in microbiology and a PhD in greenhouse gas emissions in livestock from the University of São Paulo in Brazil. André has a strong background in agronomy, his main interest being the sustainable intensification of food production and its impact from both an environmental and social perspective. Welcome, André, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Rosanna. Pleasure to be here.
Can you give us a brief overview of the study and what is the key findings from it?
Sure. This report aimed to compare the carbon footprint of milk production in different countries of the world. So what we've done was to select peer-reviewed papers from different countries that were published in scientific journals, and we recalculated the footprints. So we had to do that because different studies, they normally have different goals, and some different factors are being used on those studies. What we found was that New Zealand showed the lowest carbon footprint in the world, especially because of the pasture-based production, and compare it with the other competitors like European countries or even South American or Latin American countries like Costa Rica and Peru that had a higher carbon footprint.
So what has been people's reactions to these findings? I mean, both in New Zealand and around the world, it must have been quite interesting.
Yeah, it was unexpected. To be honest, I was surprised by all the reactions. We had mostly positive feedback from the industry, from farmers, from researchers around the world, friends and researchers. Also, we had some critics and suggestions of what we've done. Some researchers came to us saying that our assumptions were incorrect or we should change it, challenging a few of the results. And that was really useful. We took all of those critics on board. We reviewed our work, performed again the recalculations, shared it with them. And now the results changed slightly. The numbers changed on the second decimal case most of the time. But the main result of the report is still the same, showing New Zealand as the lowest carbon footprint, and it didn't change much the difference between the other countries.
I suppose that's quite an important part of that, because there's always people that will criticise what your work you've been done, but if you can go through that process and still end up with the same result, that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's how peer review works. Other scientists reading your work, challenging and questioning, and that's part of a scientist's life. We deal with that daily, and yeah, it's always good to have this. It makes the result even more robust, showing that we had feedback, critics, we consider that, and even after that, the result is still the same.
So in your view, what makes our dairy systems so efficient?
There are many factors there. First one that I would say is the nature. So we have good soil, good climate in New Zealand, and that helps a lot, especially when you compare with others. The second one, and that's a perspective from someone from abroad. I just recently came to New Zealand 1.5 years ago, just before COVID, which was very lucky from me, is that the science that is being developed here in New Zealand and the care that people have with science, farmers are applying that, the science that is being developed by the universities, by the CRIs, which is surprising to me. Of course, in other countries, farmers also consider the science, but here it seems that farmers, they have this mindset of always trying to improve, always trying to use the best and more updated science. So I think that makes a difference when you compare with other places.
So if you think about those other countries, I suppose there's a few easy solutions for them to apply to be as efficient as New Zealand, wouldn't there? What other things are stopping them doing what we're doing here?
Yeah, each country have its own challenges. It's not just, for example, trying to copy or mimic the system that we have in New Zealand in a different place. It probably won't work unless you have the same climate, you have the same soil quality, the same willing of the farmers to work with science. For example, European countries, they have the winter, so they have to have the animals indoors. You have different profile of emissions. You have emissions from the feeding for the animals. You have emissions from the manure management during this winter time, which is quite different. So they have to come with their own solutions to that. One example, I'm Brazilian, so we have South American countries and Latin American countries in our report showing high footprints. And the challenge is completely different. They are mostly pasture-based as the New Zealand system, but they have different pasture qualities, different managements, and that can make a change. So if you have a country like, for example, one country that showed a lower footprint like Uruguay, they can kind of mimic or copy the New Zealand style because they have kind of the same weather and they have the same approach with farmers. So that is reflected on their footprint as well. In summary, each country has their own challenges and I'm sure they are working on improving. So that's why we need to keep always working as well in our end.
So really what I hear from that is that in New Zealand, we're lucky in that we've got some good environmental conditions, but we've also got a group of dairy farmers and people that are willing to continuously improve and adapt new technologies.
Absolutely, yeah. The nature is the lucky part, but just nature, it wouldn't work. So that's why we have these dairy farmers and also we're talking about dairy, but also beef and sheep farmers that are working with science and are taking the most updated results from science. And that makes a lot of difference.
It must be really complex to do these sort of studies. I mean, what's really involved? Like, how does it all come together?
Yeah, well, this specific report was a review of the studies, but the life cycle assessment is the approach or the framework that we use to calculate the environmental impact of a product. So that's the calculation of the footprint. People are normally associated that with the carbon footprint, which is the most famous one, and people are more concerned about it. But also you can apply the same framework for example, water, land use, resource depletion like phosphorus or fossil fuel. It's a data-hungry process. There's a lot of data involved, a lot of questions involved, and you can play with different boundaries as well. So, for example, most of the emissions for the dairy production are up to the farm gate. So we consider the production of the inputs, like the production of the fertilizers or the fuel that is used on farm, the emission from the farm, and most of the emissions are there. You could carry on the life cycle of the product. So, for example, you could go to the processing plant, the milk processing plant. You could go to the retail, the transportation that is happening. The consumer, we at our houses, consuming the milk and the waste that happens. But that's just the emissions from there are about from 20% or less than that. So that's why most studies focus on the farm gate. And yeah, we can be a bit annoying, we scientists working with life cycle assessment, because we ask lots of questions and we want to go to the details because that's important. The details in this case are really important. So yeah, if you are thinking and want to work with life cycle assessment or calculate for your farm or for your industry, you probably get me or other colleagues asking you lots of questions, and it will take a bit of time, but it's worth at the end of the day.
Absolutely, it's worth it. Absolutely. So there's been quite a bit of media coverage about these findings and this research. Definitely some chatter happening online here in New Zealand. How can we showcase this work to support the promotion of our clean, green dairy industry? How can we make use of this?
Yeah, you are asking a scientist, so the obvious answer is a scientific paper. But also, we have been doing that for a long time. When I say we, I'm talking about AgResearch. For example, will be injustice for me to name just a few scientists that are working with that. So I'll name one, which is Stuart Ledgard, that he has been working over many years with his reports, his papers, and media releases of that. Again, a perspective from someone from abroad. Before moving to New Zealand, I was working in a project in Costa Rica and the Central America. Most people would come to me, and at the time, I would never think about coming to New Zealand, saying, oh, we know the system in New Zealand, we know they're very effective. And that's not just researchers, but also farmers. So it's already out there. People know about New Zealand, about the good work that has been doing that. So yeah, keeping the good work, keeping the science flowing, keeping the media knowing and updated about the efforts that have been done, both by farmers and being studied by the scientists.
So with your research, did you look at differences in emissions by region or by farming systems, or was there anything like that showed up?
In this specific report, no, because we were looking at like averages from the countries. So we took a general average from the systems in one specific country, like New Zealand. We know that we have different regions and they have different footprints. But that, in the case of this report, was more related to an average farm from each country. What we found that is interesting is that not just the carbon footprint, the number was different, but also I'm using a jargon here, is the profile of the greenhouse gases. When you are calculating a carbon footprint, we calculate, it's not just carbon. So we have mainly three greenhouse gases: methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide. Those are the three that we consider. And the different countries, they have different profiles. So for example, Latin American countries that showed a high carbon footprint also showed a higher amount of methane. So 85% of the total footprint was related to methane. And that's different from the European countries, that they showed sometimes an even distribution between the three gases, or even a bit like 50% of methane. New Zealand is in the middle of those two, with 65 to 70% of the total footprint being related to methane. Why is that important? As you're probably aware, the Climate Change Commission report is recommending splitting the greenhouse gases to consider the mitigation practice. And methane has a short cycle in the atmosphere. It has a stronger warming effect than, for example, carbon dioxide, but it has a smaller or lower lifetime in the atmosphere. So it warms the atmosphere for a short period, while carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, they warm the atmosphere for a long time. So that's one interesting outcome of this report, showing that it's not just the number of the footprint, but also the difference between the greenhouse gases that are important.
My understanding is that methane sort of creates more warming, but can disappear very quickly.
Precisely. Methane is part of a natural cycle. It's very different when you have, for example, the carbon dioxide being captured by the plant on the process that we all know from the school, the photosynthesis. This pasture is being eaten by the cow is processing the pasture, transforming in milk, in meat, but also there is some inefficiency, and there's the emission of methane. And that methane comes to the atmosphere, warms the atmosphere, and then is converted back to CO2. And that CO2 is back in the cycle, then being captured by the plant by photosynthesis again. That's a cycle that takes about 20 to 30 years. It's different when we drill a hole to the ground, we extract a carbon, or we extract fossil fuel that is stored there for millions of years. We burn this fossil fuel, we put them in the atmosphere. And then, yes, this CO2 that is in the atmosphere will come back eventually to the soil, but that will take millions of years. And during these times, this CO2 will be warming the atmosphere. That's why there is a whole discussion about how we treat methane. And there's some new metrics being proposed for giving less weight to methane compared to the other greenhouse gases.
And that would be why there's all this research around the belching cows and the farting cows and all that sort of stuff, right? That's the link, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the link. And we have some people here in New Zealand working with that. Professor David Frame from the University of Victoria in Wellington. And he is one of the authors of these papers from mainly people from Oxford and the UK, proposing these new metrics, considering these different lifetime or different warming effects of methane and the other greenhouse gases.
So based on the research you've seen, or the questions you've asked, is it possible for New Zealand farms to be carbon neutral?
Oh, that's a good question. We already have carbon neutral milk being sold in New Zealand, and this takes advantage of the low footprint that New Zealand have, but it's coupled with some offsetting initiatives like planting forests. I think that's one in Kaikoura, others in Singapore or South America. The problem with this approach is that offsetting the emissions is often criticized. We cannot do that forever, or we won't have land forever for doing that. So I believe that we have the potential to be even more efficient than we are and rely less on the offsetting. That would be a carbon neutral approach, but taking in consideration the critics from offsetting, we rely less on that than, for example, we are relying now with this carbon neutral milk.
So do you see that genetics could play a part in this process?
Oh, yes, especially because we saw when analyzing the greenhouse gas emissions from the farm, we see that most of the emissions are related to the enteric fermentation, the methane emission by the animals, or what people say the burping cows. So genetics could be applied as an example of breeding low methane cows, as Dr. Susan Rowe has been doing with sheep here at AgResearch, and they are now assessing the possibility of use the same technique, like breeding animals with these low methane emissions. They are as efficient as the animals now, but they are naturally emit less methane. So that we'll be doing by breeding and genetics. And the other possibility, because the carbon footprint is the total emissions of the farm divided by what is called the functional unit. In this case, is liters of milk. So if we increase the milk production, we also will have a reduction in the footprint. So breeding and artificially selecting animals that are more productive, but keeping the same emissions, we also have a reduction on the footprint, making even more efficient.
So getting more out of every cow that's on the ground.
Yeah, or making the same but emitting less methane. Those are the two main strategies. There are others, but considering genetics, I would say that those are the two main strategies.
So I suppose science really plays a strong part of helping the industry to reach its targets, and that's through changing practices, making new tools. What sort of stuff do you see coming our way to help our dairy farmers?
The first one, I already mentioned the breeding program. I think that was successful on sheep and small ruminants. They are trying to see how it can be applied to cattle. That's one. We have the development of a methane vaccine. That's more in the future that will reduce the emission artificially by a vaccine. So that's not breeding the animal, but adding some extra components on there. You have some types of feeding. There's a study in the United States that showed that feeding seaweed to cows reduces the emission of methane. Others like this kind of inhibitors as well. Most people are targeting the methane because it is the most relevant greenhouse gas on the footprint. But there are also strategies like reducing the feeding component that will reduce the carbon dioxide emissions from the production of this feeding, up to a point that you start having a trade-off. So we are reducing emissions, but also reducing the production as well. So there has to be a balance or an equilibrium there between emissions and production.
I think that's so important for us to consider, is that it's going to take all of us to play our part in reducing the carbon footprint of New Zealand. From genetics, that's where our scientists are really engaged. And I know they're doing studies about that and the work that you've been doing, and also the great work that farmers have been doing. And I think we just need to keep progressing that. By the sounds of it, sounds like we're on the right path.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. As I mentioned before, is having farmers that are engaged, having the science working, and having this good connection between science and farmers. That's one thing that I see happening a lot here in New Zealand, and maybe it does happen in other countries, but I don't see as intense as here.
Well, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today, André, and I'm glad you made it to New Zealand before you were forced into lockdown.
I'm happy as well, yeah.
It's a great place to be locked down, isn't it?
Oh, it is, yes. We're very happy to be here, especially compared with the place I was before. I was in the UK and Brazil, which is sad to say, but yeah, it's a bad situation now. So yeah, very happy to be in New Zealand.
Yes, that's not good. Right. Thank you so much, André, and we look forward to seeing more research come out.
Thank you very much, Rosanna.
Thanks for listening to CRV's Better Heard podcast. Read more about today's topic and our panel guests by visiting crv4all.co.nz. That's crv4all.co.nz. Or follow us on social media.